The desert wind howled across the outskirts of Redstone, a lonely town carved from red cliffs and dust-laden plains. Few dared live on its fringe, where law was thin and life moved as harsh and relentless as the sun that beat down each day. Among the scattered homes lived Silas Carrow, a strong Apache man whose body and mind had been honed by years of survival in the harsh desert. His hands were scarred from hunting, crafting, and defending what little land he could call his own. Yet despite his strength, Silas carried a private burden heavier than any he had faced in the unforgiving plains. That burden was his wife, Nayeli, an Apache woman of 30 whose presence was a quiet storm in their home. She had married Silas when both were young, a union of necessity more than desire, tied by family duty and the pressures of their people. Nayeli's sharp eyes and steady hands were praised in whispers among the small townfolk who knew of her, yet Silas felt the weight of her presence like an invisible chain. Every action she took, every word she spoke, reminded him of the precarious balance between duty, honor, and sorrow. Redstone streets were empty that morning, save for a few wandering traders and a distant creak of a wagon. Silas stood at the edge of their modest clearing, staring across the horizon where cliffs met the sky. Nayeli emerged from their dwelling, her long black hair catching the sunlight, and for a moment he remembered promises made long ago, promises of partnership and survival. Now they felt more like obligations he could neither fulfill nor escape. "You're staring again," Nayeli said softly, her voice a mixture of fatigue and something deeper, something unspoken that seemed heavier than the desert heat. "I'm thinking," Silas muttered, his voice low and rough. He did not look at her. The burden of unspoken decisions pressed too heavily to share. "I know," she replied, almost as if reading his thoughts. "You think I am a burden, that I weigh too heavily on you." Silas finally met her eyes. "I feel it every day. Your presence. It reminds me of everything I cannot change." He ran a hand across his jaw, ashamed at the honesty. Nayeli did not flinch. She never did. The day passed with the sun crawling across the sky, each moment heavier than the last. Silas hunted and tended to their sparse land with mechanical precision, but his mind kept returning to the same gnawing thought: how to bear this burden without shattering the fragile balance between life and survival. He had heard stories from Apache elders of courage, sacrifice, and finality rituals he had avoided for fear of what they demanded. Yet as he watched Nayeli carefully gather herbs from their small garden, her movements precise and deliberate, he realized that a change, some irreversible act, was approaching. Evening fell, painting the desert in a burnished glow. The town's sparse population seemed to gather unknowingly at the edges, sensing the weight of something inevitable in the air. Nayeli stepped outside, her amber eyes reflecting the dying sun. She gazed toward the cliffs, expression unreadable, almost mournful. Silas joined her silently. "It's getting late," he said, though neither intended to sleep. There was an unspoken understanding. The night would bring decisions the day could not. Nayeli finally spoke, her voice firm, carrying a weight that silenced even the wind. "You think I am a burden. Perhaps I am. But burdens can be transformed or removed." Her words cut through him like a whip of cold air. He felt a chill not from the desert night but from inevitability he could sense. He wanted to argue, to deny it, to cling to hope, but deep down he knew she was right. The change, whatever it would be, had to come. The first stars blinked awake as Silas and Nayeli stood side by side. Around them, Redstone slept or pretended to. Few knew that what would happen tonight would ripple through every cabin and alley, leaving sorrow and shock in its wake. And yet, amidst the tension, there was a strange clarity. Decisions once hidden in shadows were ready to step into the light. Nayeli's eyes met Silas, steady and unyielding. In them, he saw not love, but truth. And the truth, however brutal, was a path that had to be walked. The night held its breath. Redstone would never be the same. Night had fallen over the Redstone desert, the sky a canvas of stars, each one cold and distant like the thoughts running through Silas Carrow's mind. He and Nayeli had remained on the edge of their clearing long after sunset, the silence between them heavy, almost unbearable. The wind whispered through the red cliffs, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl echoed, as if warning of the night's approaching inevitability. Nayeli finally broke the silence, her voice steady yet filled with an unshakable gravity. "Silas, tonight must end differently. You've carried your doubts long enough, and I have carried mine. The town, they will never understand the weight we bear. But we must act before it becomes too late." Silas's jaw tightened. "I don't know if I can, Nayeli. Whatever you're thinking, it's more than just difficult. It's impossible. The others, Redstone, they'll—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. He knew the townsfolk's judgment would be swift, unforgiving. Their whispers could turn into a storm that would destroy everything. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Nayeli's plan was already in motion. She turned to him, her amber eyes reflecting the moonlight like molten gold. "Silas, do you trust me?" He hesitated. Trust was a fragile thing in their lives, tested by years of survival in harsh lands, by obligations to their people, and by burdens neither wanted to speak aloud. But in that moment, looking at her steady, unwavering gaze, he realized he had no choice. "I do," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Then follow me," she said. Nayeli stepped into the darkness, moving with the grace and certainty of someone entirely at peace with what she had decided. Silas followed, each step crunching softly over the desert floor. The night was cool, but the tension between them burned hotter than the day ever could. They reached the cliff's edge where the wind carved jagged paths through the sandstone. Nayeli looked down at the town below. The streets were nearly empty, the saloons dark, a few lanterns flickering in windows. A silence hung over Redstone as though it, too, sensed the storm about to unfold. "I have done what I must," Nayeli said, her voice a low, haunting melody that seemed to merge with the desert wind. "You've lived with the weight of me as a burden, Silas. I've known it, too. But there is a way to end this. For all of us." Silas felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean?" Nayeli didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the folds of her simple cloak and withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden box worn by time and travel. She held it out to him. "This contains what must be given back to the land and to the people of Redstone. When the time comes, you must place it where the earth drinks it in. Then we will see if the town can forgive what is necessary." Silas took the box with trembling hands. It was surprisingly heavy, not with weight, but with the gravity of its purpose. He wanted to ask more, to plead with her to explain, but Nayeli only shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Some truths are too deep for words, Silas. Tonight we act. The consequences will unfold, and the town will witness what has been kept from them." They descended the rocky path toward the center of Redstone cautiously, shadows among shadows. Silas's heart pounded with each step. He knew the townsfolk would sense something unusual, an energy in the air that could not be explained. A few figures stirred in the dim light of the main street, and Silas felt the weight of their eyes without seeing them. Finally, they reached the small clearing near the town's water well. Nayeli knelt, carefully setting the box on the ground. She placed her hands over it, muttering words Silas did not understand, words that seemed older than the cliffs themselves. The wind gusted around them, scattering dust and whispers in a spiral that made Silas feel both terrified and awestruck. "Silas," Nayeli said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time that night, When I step back, do not hesitate. You must do this. For us, for them, for Redstone." Silas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He lifted the box and buried it slowly, deliberately, in the sand and clay. As he did, the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. The air vibrated with a low hum, almost like a heartbeat. He glanced at Nayeli. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, but also a quiet resolve that steadied his own trembling hands. Above, the stars shimmered more brightly than he had ever seen, and the wind seemed to sigh in relief, as if the land itself had acknowledged what had been done. Silas realized in that moment that nothing would ever be the same, not for him, not for Nayeli, not for the town that would awaken tomorrow to the consequences of their actions. They rose together, side by side, leaving the buried secret behind. Silas didn't speak. Nayeli didn't speak. But each knew that Redstone was on the brink of a revelation so deep and sorrowful that when it came, the town would weep with them, whether they understood or not. The night swallowed them as they returned to the edge of their home, and the desert fell silent again, holding its breath for what was to come. The sun rose slowly over Redstone, spilling gold and copper across the red cliffs and dusty streets. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if it had sensed the night's events in ways its residents could not yet name. Silas Carrow and Nayeli stood at the edge of their home, watching the horizon. The desert wind carried the faint scent of burned sage and turned the small particles of sand into a haze that shimmered in the morning light. "Silas," Nayeli whispered, her voice still heavy from the night before, "they will notice soon. The town, it will see what has been done." Silas tightened his jaw. He had expected as much. He had buried the wooden box with trembling hands, following Nayeli's precise instructions. But he had not anticipated the weight of watching the town slowly awaken to something it did not yet understand. "I know," he said, voice low. "They don't understand. And when they do, there will be anger. Maybe sorrow. Maybe both." By mid-morning, the first signs appeared. Townsfolk, going about their daily routines, began murmuring among themselves, glancing toward the desert outskirts with suspicion and unease. Whispers of a strange energy, of a disturbance in the land, spread quickly. Horses neighed nervously, and dogs barked at nothing visible. Silas and Nayeli watched silently. Knowing the cause of the unrest was the buried box, the sacred object that had to remain secret until the ritual completed itself. A small group of townsfolk approached cautiously. Led by Marshal Hawkins, a man whose authority was rooted more in respect than in law. "Silas," he called, keeping his distance, "have you or Nayeli seen anything strange out here?" His eyes flicked to Nayeli, lingering on her long dark hair and calm, controlled stance. Silas shook his head slowly. "Nothing that can't be explained by wind and desert sun," he said, though every fiber of his being screamed that the truth was far more complicated. Nayeli stepped forward, her voice calm yet commanding. "Sometimes the land speaks for itself," she said, almost to herself, almost to the wind. "And sometimes people aren't ready to hear it." Her words sent a ripple of unease through the townsfolk. They had heard strange things about her, of course, but seeing her stand there with such quiet authority was unnerving. As the day wore on, the disturbances grew more pronounced. Dust spiraled from the desert in sudden, unnatural whirlwinds. Rocks and sand shifted along paths that should have remained still. The townsfolk began to murmur in alarm. A few brave souls ventured closer to Silas and Nayeli's cabin, only to be stopped by a sudden hush that seemed to ripple across the desert itself. It was as if the earth were holding its breath. Silas watched it all, a mixture of pride and fear knotting his chest. Nayeli had warned him that the ritual would be visible in some way. He had not expected it to be so undeniable. People began pointing, whispering, some crossing themselves, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Mothers pulled children close, and even hardened men paused mid-step, eyes wide-eyed by evening. The box's influence had fully revealed itself. From the desert, a faint glow emerged where Silas had buried it, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The townsfolk gathered at a safe distance, murmuring prayers, gasping in shock, and clutching each other in fear and awe. No one dared approach too closely. Even Marshal Hawkins, a man accustomed to danger, stood rooted to the spot. Nayeli, I turned to Silas, her expression unreadable yet resolute. "It is done," she said softly. "The burden. It is no longer ours alone. The land has accepted it, and soon the town will understand." Silas exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and dread. The act that had weighed on him, that had kept him awake for nights, was no longer a private secret. Redstone would bear witness to something extraordinary, something that would leave its mark on every life there. The townsfolk began to sob quietly, some openly, some silently. No one could explain why. They only knew that what they saw was sacred, terrifying, and beautiful all at once. The desert wind carried their cries across the cliffs, reaching Silas and Nayeli as they watched the ritual's effects unfold. Silas placed a hand on Nayeli's shoulder, feeling the steady strength of the woman who had guided him through this impossible night. "I don't think they'll ever forget this," he said. "No," Nayeli replied, her voice barely a whisper, "and neither will we." The sun set behind the cliffs, painting the desert in shades of fire and blood. The town of Redstone would awaken tomorrow to a new reality, one shaped by courage, sorrow, and a burden transformed into something far greater than anyone had imagined. Silas and Nayeli stood together in the quiet dusk, knowing that the coming days would test them, but also that the town's tears were a beginning, a testament to the profound mystery they had unleashed. The morning after the ritual, Redstone woke to an uncanny stillness. The desert air was heavier than usual, the sun cutting through a thin haze that clung to the streets and alleys. Whispers passed from cabin to cabin, from saloon to general store, and from the stoic faces of farmers to the children who had ventured too close to the edge of town. Something had happened, something that none could fully explain. Silas Carrow and Nayeli remained at the outskirts of their home, watching the town's reaction from a distance. The box had been buried, the ritual performed, and the strange pulse in the desert had subsided to a faint, almost imperceptible glow that now lingered beneath the earth. Yet the effect on Redstone's people was immediate. Faces once familiar seemed unfamiliar now, eyes wide, mouths open in disbelief, hands clutching one another as if bracing for an unseen storm. "They're frightened," Silas said quietly, his voice tense with both concern and wonder. But not in anger. Something else. Sorrow, maybe. Recognition, perhaps. Nayeli's amber eyes scanned the town, calm but piercing. "It is what I expected," she replied. "The burden we carried, it was never ours alone. The land, the people, they must see it now in all its weight." Down in the town, Marshal Hawkins was already speaking with a group of elders and traders, their voices low and urgent. Something about the earth, the air, the very energy of the desert had shifted. No one could explain it, but all felt it. A sense of deep loss, almost like mourning for a wrong that had never been acknowledged, settled over Redstone. By midday, small groups of townsfolk cautiously approached the outskirts, curious and fearful. They saw Silas and Nayeli standing together, a striking pair. The Apache warrior, muscular and shirtless with long black hair and tribal jewelry, and the woman whose calm authority had orchestrated the mysterious events. Whispers ran through the crowd. Some called them sorcerers, Others said they were chosen by the land itself. A young farmer stepped forward, his eyes wide. Silas, Nayeli, what is happening? Why does the desert? It feels alive. And the ground, it hums. Silas shook his head slowly, choosing his words carefully. The earth has seen the burdens we carry. It has accepted them, and it will teach what we could not explain in words. Nayeli stepped beside him, her presence commanding silence. What you feel is the sorrow we carried in silence, the weight of promises, of duties unfulfilled, of burdens placed upon hearts not ready to bear them. It is not punishment, but revelation. The townsfolk, initially skeptical, began to feel it in their bones. A shiver ran through them, not of cold, but of profound understanding. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by emotion. Others covered their mouths, tears spilling freely. Even hardened men, accustomed to the brutal realities of the frontier, could not hide their tears. Redstone wept collectively, not for themselves, but for the sorrow and courage of those who had carried burdens they could never fully imagine. Silas glanced at Nayeli, her face serene, almost sorrowful. "Do you think they understand?" he asked quietly. "They will," she replied. "It takes time for hearts to open to truth so heavy. But seeing them weep, it is the beginning." Hours passed, and the town slowly regained composure. Yet the hum of the earth remained, faint but persistent, like a pulse echoing through the red cliffs. Redstone had changed, though the people did not yet fully comprehend how. Each soul who had witnessed the ritual carried a mark, an invisible thread connecting them to the land, to Silas and Nayeli, and to the buried burden that had been transformed. As dusk fell, Silas and Nayeli returned to their small clearing, the desert stretching endlessly beyond them. Silas exhaled, feeling the weight of relief and trepidation in equal measure. "It's done," he murmured. "But what now? How do we live knowing what they've seen?" Nayeli placed a hand on his chest over the steady beat of his heart. "We live, Silas. We live with truth, with the land, and with each other. The sorrow of Redstone is not a punishment, it is recognition. And recognition is the first step toward understanding." They stood together in the twilight, the last rays of sun illuminating the rugged desert. Redstone would awaken tomorrow to a world subtly transformed, carrying the echoes of the burdens that had once been theirs alone. And somewhere deep in the desert, the buried box pulsed faintly, a silent testament to courage, sorrow, and the unbreakable bonds between land, people, and those brave enough to bear burdens for the sake of all. By the 5th day after the ritual, Redstone was no longer the quiet desert town it had been. Whispers had grown into conversations, and conversations into murmurs of fear and reverence. The townsfolk could no longer ignore the strange energy that seemed to hum through the land. Horses refused to cross certain patches of ground, water in the wells seemed to shimmer faintly, and even the wind carried an unexplainable chill. The people had begun to gather near the outskirts, drawn as if by instinct, to the place where Silas Carrow and Nayeli had performed the mysterious burial. Silas stood near the edge of the desert, muscles taut, dark hair falling over his broad shoulders, tribal jewelry catching the harsh sunlight. His eyes, calm yet intense, scanned the crowd below. Nayeli stood beside him, her hands clasped over her chest, the weight of her 30 years of wisdom and sorrow reflected in her steady gaze. Both were aware that the town was beginning to understand the true scale of the burden they had carried and the sacrifice that had been required. A hush fell over the gathering as Marshal Hawkins and a few brave townsfolk stepped forward. "Silas, Nayeli," the marshal called, his voice trembling slightly despite his usual composure. "We've felt it. The land? It's changed. But we don't understand. What have you done?" Silas met the marshal's gaze, holding his composure. "We bore a burden that was not ours alone," he said slowly, "one that could no longer remain hidden. The ritual. It was necessary to balance the sorrow we carried with the land itself. It was not done lightly." The townsfolk exchanged glances, some skeptical, some frightened, but all drawn to the undeniable truth in Silas's words. Nayeli stepped forward, her amber eyes catching the sunlight, reflecting both sorrow and authority. "The burden you feel in your hearts," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "is not punishment. It is recognition. The land, the people, even you, have carried the weight of what was kept secret too long. Tonight you will see the full measure of it." As she spoke, a faint glow began to emerge from the desert floor near the buried box. Dust swirled in a circle around it, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low hum like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The townsfolk gasped, some stepping back in fear, others dropping to their knees, overwhelmed by the powerful energy that pulsed through the desert. Silas placed a hand gently on Nayeli's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they had prepared for. "The burden is now ours no longer," he said quietly, more to her than to the crowd. "But what must happen? Must be seen by all." Nayeli nodded, her gaze fixed on the glowing earth. "Silas now." Together they approached the spot where the wooden box had been buried. Silas knelt, brushing away the dust to reveal its carved surface once more. He lifted it reverently, holding it high so the townsfolk could see. Nayeli raised her hands, murmuring words older than Redstone itself, words that carried power, sorrow, and absolution. The glow intensified, expanding into a circle of light that seemed to encompass the entire gathering. Gasps, cries, and murmurs of awe swept through the crowd. Some fell to their knees, tears streaming freely, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of emotion and mystery. Others clutched one another, sensing the sorrow and courage that Silas and Nayeli had carried silently for years. Even Marshal Hawkins, usually composed and rational, could not hide the tears that welled in his eyes. Silas spoke again, his voice carrying across the desert. "What you see is not punishment. It is truth. It is the weight of burdens borne with courage. Nayeli and I carried it so that you could see, so that you could understand. We ask only for recognition, not forgiveness. For some truths cannot be undone." The crowd remained silent, each person trembling as the glow gradually dimmed, leaving a faint shimmer in the sand as a reminder of what had transpired. Sobs echoed across the desert, but they were not cries of despair. They were cries of understanding, of shared sorrow, of witnessing something extraordinary. Nayel, I lowered her hands, the glow fading completely. She turned to Silas, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It is done," she said softly. "The burden is no longer ours alone. The town has seen. The land has accepted it. And we live," Silas finished, his voice steady but low. "We live with truth and with each other." As the townsfolk slowly began to disperse, still murmuring and weeping quietly, Silas and Nayeli stood together in the fading light, knowing that Redstone would never forget this day. They had shared their sorrow, their courage, and their burden with the town, and the echoes of it would shape every life in Redstone. From this day forward, the desert stretched endlessly beyond them, quiet now, holding its secrets and its truths. Silas and Nayeli remained side by side, bound by the weight of what they had carried, and the knowledge that they had changed the town forever. By the sixth day, Redstone was completely consumed by the mysterious force that had begun with Silas Carrow and Nayeli's ritual. The townsfolk moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, and no one ventured near the desert outskirts without a mix of curiosity and dread. The desert itself seemed alive, its silence charged with a tension that left even the hardiest ranchers uneasy. Every footstep on the sand carried weight, and every glance toward the cliffs hinted at a truth too powerful to ignore. Silas and Nayeli watched from a small ridge above the town, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. Silas's long black hair fell over his broad shoulders, his muscular frame tense with anticipation. Tribal jewelry glinted faintly in the early light, symbols of his heritage and strength. Nayeli stood beside him, calm but unwavering, her amber eyes scanning the town like a hawk observing prey. Together they were an unspoken promise. The burden had been shared, and the time for understanding or reckoning was near. The townsfolk had begun to notice strange phenomena again. Wells shimmered as though reflecting more than the sky above. The desert floor vibrated faintly beneath their feet, and dust swirled in patterns that seemed intentional, almost like a language of the land itself. Children had been kept inside, and even the saloon's rowdiest men whispered to one another in fear. Some claimed to hear faint whispers in the wind, voices of the past, voices of ancestors, carrying messages no one could decipher. Marshal Hawkins approached cautiously with a few elders, their eyes wide with a mix of reverence and terror. Silas. Nayeli, the marshal said, his voice tight. The town. It's as if the land itself is speaking. The people are frightened, but they feel something else. Something sorrowful and powerful. Silas nodded slowly, the lines of his face drawn tight. It is as it should be. The ritual we performed. It has revealed the burden we carried, the truth we bore in silence. Redstone cannot unsee it, and neither can the land. What they feel is recognition, not punishment. Nayeli stepped forward, raising her hands toward the desert, the ritual's remnants resonating with her movements. This burden is ours no longer, she said, her voice carrying with clarity across the sands. It is for the town, for the land, and for those who walk these streets in ignorance of the weight we've carried. The sorrow you feel, it is not yours alone, nor mine. It is shared by all who bear witness. Suddenly, the buried wooden box pulsed faintly beneath the sand, emitting a soft, golden light. Dust swirled around it in small tornadoes, moving in patterns that mesmerized and terrified the observers. The townsfolk gasped, some falling to their knees, others covering their mouths, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. Even the most hardened men, accustomed to the frontier's harshness, could not hide their awe or the tears forming in their eyes. Silas turned to Nayeli, his voice low but firm. It's time. We must finish this. We've shared the burden, and now the town must see its final form. Nayeli nodded solemnly. Together, they descended from the ridge, their presence commanding yet solemn. Silas lifted the wooden box carefully, its weight familiar, sacred, and terrifying all at once. Nayeli raised her hands in a final gesture, chanting softly in the Apache tongue. The desert responded. The ground vibrated. The wind carried her voice across Redstone, and the golden light from the box expanded, enveloping the townsfolk in an aura of pure, raw emotion. Cries erupted, not of fear, but of overwhelming sorrow and understanding. Mothers clutched one another, men wept openly, and even the silent elders fell to their knees, moved by the visible, undeniable power of the ritual. The entire town was united in a single, indescribable moment of shared grief and revelation. Silas spoke once more, his voice steady but emotional. This burden we carried. Nayeli and I bore it so the town could witness what it means to carry sorrow and courage together. Let this be remembered, not with fear, but with respect for truth and sacrifice. Nayeli lowered her hands, the golden glow from the box fading slowly into the earth. The desert became still once more, but the imprint of their actions lingered in every soul. Redstone had witnessed something extraordinary. something both heartbreaking and beautiful as the sun dipped below the cliffs. Silas and Nayeli stood together, side by side, their faces illuminated by the last rays of light. They had shared their burden, revealed the truth, and changed Redstone forever. And somewhere deep beneath the desert sands, the box rested, a silent testament to courage, sorrow, and the unbreakable bond between land, people, and those brave enough to bear burdens for all. The seventh day dawned with an eerie stillness over Redstone. The townsfolk moved cautiously through the streets, their eyes lingering on the desert outskirts as if expecting the land itself to speak again. The events of the past 6 days had left an indelible mark: fear, awe, sorrow, and something deeper they could not name. Word had spread of the strange energy, the glowing box, and the ritual performed by Silas Carrow and Nayeli. Even the bravest souls avoided the outskirts, whispering prayers to whatever spirits might be watching. Silas and Nayeli stood at the edge of their clearing, their silhouettes stark against the early light. Silas, muscular and imposing, shirtless with long black hair cascading over his shoulders, tribal jewelry catching the first rays of sun, gazed down at the town. Nayeli, calm and regal, stood beside him, her amber eyes reflecting both sorrow and resolve. The burden they had carried for so long was now shared by the land and the people, but there remained one final act to seal the ritual and leave Redstone forever changed. "They are ready," Nayeli whispered. "The town has seen, felt, and wept, but they do not yet fully understand the depth of what has been born." Silas nodded, placing a steady hand over hers. "Then it's time." Together, they descended to the spot where the wooden box had been buried, now glowing faintly beneath the desert sands. The townsfolk gathered at a safe distance, forming a semicircle of trembling, wide-eyed witnesses. Whispers and murmurs filled the air, punctuated by quiet gasps as the box's golden light began to pulse stronger. Almost like a heartbeat, Silas lifted the box with reverence, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a symbol of the truth he and Nayeli had carried. He turned to the town, his voice carrying across the desert. "This is the burden we bore. Nayeli and I carried it silently for years, bound by honor, love, and duty. Now you see what it means to live with sorrow, to face truths that cannot be spoken, and to honor them." Nayeli stepped forward, her hands raised in a final ritual gesture, her voice chanting in the ancient Apache tongue. The air seemed to hum with energy, vibrating through the desert, through Redstone, through every soul present. The townsfolk gasped and wept, the sorrow they felt now mingled with understanding. Fathers held their wives tightly, elders bowed their heads, and even the marshal covered his face as tears streamed silently. Suddenly, a radiant column of light shot upward from the buried box, illuminating the desert cliffs, the town, and the people in a blinding, holy brilliance. Silas and Nayeli stood together, holding the box high, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion, sorrow, and awe. The desert seemed alive, pulsating with the energy of their ritual. The townsfolk fell to their knees, crying not only for the burden Silas and Nayeli had carried, but for the shared humanity that now connected them all. Silas lowered the box gently, placing it back into the sands. The glow dimmed slowly, fading into the earth, leaving only a faint shimmer as a testament to what had been done. Nayeli lowered her hands, exhaling deeply, her eyes meeting Silas's. "It is finished," she whispered. Silas nodded, the tension leaving his broad shoulders. "The burden is no longer ours alone," he said softly. "It belongs to the land, the town, to everyone who witnessed it." The townsfolk rose slowly, their expressions a mix of grief, awe, and gratitude. Some fell to their knees again, bowing in respect. Others quietly approached Silas and Nayeli, touching their hands or shoulders, acknowledging the courage it had taken to bear what no one else could. Tears streamed freely, but there was no chaos, only a shared, silent understanding that Redstone would never be the same dot as the sun set behind the cliffs, casting the desert in shades of fire and gold. Silas and Nayeli stood together at the edge of the clearing. The town had witnessed the power of their courage and sorrow, and the land had accepted the burden they had carried in silence. No words were needed. Every tear, every glance, every quiet sob spoke volumes. Redstone had been changed forever. Not by law, not by gold, not by guns, but by truth, by sacrifice, and by the bravery of two people willing to carry a burden that no one else could bear. Silas placed a hand gently on Nayeli's shoulder, their gazes fixed on the horizon. "We did what had to be done," he said quietly. "Yes," Nayeli replied. "And the town will remember not with fear, but with understanding." The desert wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying the echoes of tears, courage, and sorrow into the endless horizon. Silas Carrow and Nayeli had fulfilled their duty, released their burden, and left Redstone forever changed, its people humbled, enlightened, and united in a sorrow that had become a shared testament to the strength of human spirit and the mysteries of the land. They called home Dot, and as the night fell, the town of Redstone slept under a sky full of stars, each one a silent witness to the courage and sacrifice of the Apache warrior and his steadfast wife.